My question was, what is God calling you to do? And last week, I narrowed it into something very specific so that we would be able to answer. And we had some great thoughts on this. Someone said to encourage someone else in response to our prayer and in response to what others may be doing is be a good sister. And someone else said, listen. These were fantastic answers, no less great than today's responses to our question. These are tangible ways we can respond to God's voice in our lives. But what if you were Jeremiah? Jeremiah had a difficult task. As you all know, he was an ancient Israelite priest who lived and worked in Jerusalem around the final decades of the kingdom of southern Judah. And God called him to warn his people about the consequences of breaking their divine covenant. So he spoke out against injustice. In today's reading, he was specifically focused on leaders. And that's why I asked that question, how do we speak truth to power in love? How can we speak out? These were the priests, the kings, and the prophets of ancient Israel. And they were committing lots of unjust acts. They were taking advantage of the most vulnerable people, the widows, orphans, and immigrants. And they were oppressing these weaker and helpless people. And this was what Jeremiah spoke out against. And they didn't like it. Then, just as now, speaking out against powerful people didn't go well. Those who have power don't like when someone tells them that they're abusing it. But Jeremiah didn't have an axe to grind against any of the people who were abusing their power and authority. And in fact, he felt a sense of empathy for them. And this is a part of this lesson for us. Walter Brueggemann writes, he yearned for peace as much as anyone. He wanted business as usual, but the suffering, oppression, and violence all around him caused him to feel like he needed to do something. The violation of God's covenant changed what he felt like he could do. God called him, and he knew what that calling was. It was to speak out. Still, speaking out against powerful people who are unjust shouldn't dehumanize them. They're still children of God who are loved by God, and we shouldn't have something against them personally. Yet today it's all mixed up. So often we cannot talk about a subject or an issue. It becomes personal. It becomes so closely associated with an individual or various individuals that it becomes a personal attack. People both take it that way and mean it that way. And when we look at Jeremiah, we see sort of a scriptural example of what Nadine mentioned in that question of talking about the subject and not attacking the people. We need to have empathy for those who have power and authority. And when people who can make a difference don't, it makes me sad. When people who could use their power or their influence for good use it for their own gain, I feel bad, not just because of that action, but I feel bad for them because the world would be a better place if they used those resources for good. It would be better for them and it would be better for everyone. But I don't need to tell you, we all know that's not the world we live in. So sometimes we have to speak out. And this is Jeremiah. This is a lesson we can learn from him for today. Speak out. Speak the truth and do it in love. Don't dehumanize the other. Don't lash out in hatred or anger. Always remember that you belong to God, and the other person who you're telling this to, the person you're speaking out against their action, also belongs to God, is also a child of God and loved by their Creator. And only speak what God leads you to speak. This is why it's so complicated, and it takes courage. And when you're the only one, or you're the first one to speak out, it can also be lonely, like a prophet's voice crying out in the wilderness all alone. And this is where Jeremiah is a model for that spiritual audacity. Jeremiah, in our reading this morning, cannot not speak. Note the double negative there. He wasn't looking for an opportunity. He didn't wake up that morning and say, how am I going to upset the leaders today? No, Jeremiah knew what God was calling him to do, and he felt like he was pushed in that direction. The opening line of our reading says, "Oh Lord, you have enticed me. You have overpowered me." In other words, this is your thing, God. These feelings are powerful, and even though he knows that God is leading his actions, the powerful people he called out weren't taking it too well. I've become a laughing stock, he says. But this feeling is so deep that the only thing he can do is respond in poetry. And that's what our reading is. It's a prayer to God, it's a conversation with God, but it's also ancient Hebrew poetry. In the poetry of our lesson, he fumbles for words, like leading into this double negative. I cannot not speak. Our reading depicts Jeremiah trying to remain silent. He says in verse 9, if I say that I will not mention God or speak what God tells me to speak, then there's a fire burning in my heart. It sounds like he's breaking into an Adele song right there in verse 9. I couldn't not hear it as I read this passage again and again this week. I tried to, and then I'd come home humming Adele. He had to speak the truth, even if people didn't like it because of what they were doing. They needed to hear this truth. God encourages the people who are committed to God's cause to speak out. And that's us. That's us today. Yet reading these verses in their context shows just how hard this can be. Jeremiah acknowledged that God responds in love. And at the end of our reading, he said, "Oh Lord," in verse 12, "Lord of hosts, you test the righteous. You're testing us. Let me see what you can do." In other words, show me, God, show me. But then before God does anything, verse 13 has this utterance of praise. And I wish that we had the vocal intonation or facial expression or some stage direction, because in the end of the reading he says, "Sing to the Lord, praise to the Lord, for he has delivered the life of the needy from the hands of the evildoers." Our reading stops there in verse 13, and well it should. But if you go on later today sometime, look at verses 14 to 18. It gets really hard. It takes a very dark turn right after that. Even within the 7 verses of our reading, we see Jeremiah wrestling with this tension of prayer. In verse 11, he said, "The Lord is with me, therefore my persecutors will stumble." That's a bold expression of confidence in God, but it's especially jarring when we juxtapose it with the lament of verse 7. God, you've enticed me. This is your fault. This is your thing. I didn't want to do this. They're in the same prayer. In the same sentence to God, we have, this is your fault, and you're going to protect me. Like our prayers, in Jeremiah's we find 2 opposing forces, standing beside one another. We want logical connections. We want a literary flow. We want this narrative that leads straight into some sort of doctrine or confession, or even, if we're really being honest, some bumper sticker theology. But instead, we get this complexity. Life's not like things that are tied up neatly with a ribbon on top and all fits together cleanly, especially when we're being honest with the complicated situations in life, even local ones like Vinegar Hill. In one sentence, we might beg God for help with everything from the depths of our being. We might beg for God's guidance or assistance or whatever it is that we need and are wrestling with. But then in the next sentence, just like Jeremiah, we remember that God is God, and we start to think about the great things we've seen God do. We start to think about the hymns of our hearts. Wherever He leads, I'll go. And we start to say through gritted teeth, praise you, sing to the Lord, sing praises to God anew. How do we put these pieces together, and how can we continue responding in this calling to speak out? There's one of the key elements that hasn't come up yet in this reading, and that is grace. Responding to God, living in faith, speaking out to those who have power and authority requires grace. It requires us to extend grace to ourselves, and it requires us to be able to extend grace to the other. That's the only way we can sometimes see someone with empathy who has been behaving very badly. Paul Tillich, in a sermon, provides an example of this kind of grace. He said, grace strikes us when we're in great pain and restlessness. Great pain, restlessness, that sense of struggle. That's when God is there waiting and offering grace, ready to pour it down on us so that we can continue moving in our calling and responding however God leads us. Pain is real. It's a part of life. Jeremiah faced the derision and mocking of a people who didn't want to hear what God was telling him to say. Today, if God calls you or me to speak out or speak up for those who don't have a voice, there are going to be people who don't like it. We might even experience pain. Jeremiah certainly did. Just before our reading, Pashur, the son of Immer, who was the chief officer in the house of the Lord, hit him. He struck Jeremiah and then put him into some shackles. Yet Jeremiah, even with physical assault, didn't stop speaking. He didn't stop speaking out against those in power who were oppressing the people. He kept following God, kept doing what God called him to do. And all of this, when we look, we can and open our eyes to it, we can see grace surrounding both his prophecy and our lives when we're moving and following God wherever he leads, we go. So do what God calls you to do today. Do it with a bold commitment to be the people that you are called to be. When it's hard, extend grace to yourself, but keep doing it. Keep standing for truth. Stand for those who cannot stand for themselves, and be the people God is calling you to be. God is with you. God is leading, and God will guide you. Amen.